Have we started the webinar?
Not yet, just giving it another 30 seconds or so.
Okay. Hi, everybody. We're going to take a minute to let more people join. There are a lot of you. You might want to put in the chat where you're from. We always like to see where everybody is from. So say hello, let us know where you're from, and we'll start in just a minute. Okay, just to repeat, if you want to let us know where you're from in the chat, that would be great. Tell us who you are, where you're from, and we'll begin in just a minute when more of you have joined. We got a big crowd here today, so we'll give it a minute. We're going to take a little bit longer this time just because the numbers are high. And I suppose people will continue coming in while I'm introducing our guests. Okay, welcome everyone. And thank you for joining us. I'm James Shaheen, Tricycle's Editor-in-Chief, and I'm happy to be with you today for a special discussion with Stephen Batchelor and Donald S. Lopez Jr. Today's Zoom session will be recorded and we'll share the replay link in a follow-up email. We'll be leaving time for questions at the end. You can ask a question by typing it into the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. So make sure your question goes in the Q&A tab and not in the chat, because if it's in the chat, I may miss it. We'll get to as many of your questions as we can. We'll try to get a general drift of the questions and ask Stephen and Dawn. There are so many of you, not all of you will be able to ask your questions. This is a Tricycle Premium event, so a special welcome to our premium subscribers. If you're not a premium subscriber, you can sign up at tricycle.org/subscribe or upgrade your account. We hold events like this every month for premium subscribers. Premium subscribers also receive one free digital gift subscription, a monthly newsletter from our in-house scholars, and a quarterly newsletter offering a behind-the-scenes look at our new issue. So finally, Tricycle is a not-for-profit, and if you'd like to learn more about our mission or donate to Tricycle, visit tricycle.org/donate. Boy, we're getting a lot of people today. Okay. So our guests today are Donald S. Lopez Jr. and Stephen Batchelor. Don is Arthur E. Link Distinguished University Professor of Buddhist and Tibetan Studies at the University of Michigan. He is the author or editor of many books, including Buddhism, A Journey Through History, which has been nominated for a Pulitzer. And the book we'll discuss today, The Buddha, Biography of a Myth. Don lives in New York City. Also, since we just had the World Series, I have to mention Buddha Takes the Mound, Enlightenment in 9 Innings, which Don wrote some time ago. And even though I'm a Dodger fan, a rabid Dodger fan, and the book is Yankee-centric, I still highly recommend it. I loved it. It's my favorite book ever about Buddhism and baseball, if not the only one. I don't know if there's another one, but another one is on the way, I hear. Okay, Stephen Batchelor is a teacher and scholar of Buddhism. His many works include Buddhism Without Beliefs, Secular Buddhism, and most recently, Buddha, Socrates, and Us, Ethical Living in Uncertain Times. He lives in La Sauve, France, near Bordeaux. I should mention that the list of books that they've written is actually much longer. I just picked out a few that you might have heard of. So let's begin. Hi, Don. Hi, Stephen. It's great to see you
Hi,
both.
James.
James.
It's good to see you. So you've written two very different books. Could you each, in a nutshell, tell us what you hope to achieve in your books? We can start with you, Don.
So I've written quite a bit about the European encounter with Buddhism. I did a book called From Stone to Flesh, which looked at the earliest European encounters going up to the 19th century, really looking at the Buddha from being an idol and a purveyor of idolater to be defeated by the Roman Catholic Church to being a philosopher of the French Enlightenment, as portrayed by people like Eugène Burnouf and Oldenburg. But in that, I found that the Buddha had sort of been turned into sort of a black and white figure, a teacher of liberty and fraternity and equality. And this was not the Buddha that I knew from Buddhist communities. So I thought I'd try to write a book that portrayed the Buddha as he's been understood by Buddhist communities over the millennia. These European scholars had demythologized the Buddha, is the term that is often used when we talk about the study of religion. So I tried to remythologize him by, I guess, restoring the miracle and wonder around that surrounds the Buddha that I've seen in so many beautiful Buddhist texts. That's the short answer.
Don, I should just tell you that we have a Blue Jays fan here, or probably many, and we just want to let them know they're welcome. So, Stephen.
Uh, I've been on a quest to find the historical Buddha, which on reading Don's book, you might start to have serious doubts about. But this is something that's preoccupied me for a number of years, actually going back to about 25 years, actually, where I set out in earnest to try to track down this guy, the Buddha, Gautama. I've already explored in two of my previous books, Confession of a Buddhist Atheist and After Buddhism, attempts to recover something from the early Pali materials primarily of, in fact, the human being who lies behind all of these incredible myths and stories and images and artworks and so on. And what I've attempted to do in the current book, Buddha, Socrates, and Us, is to actually reflect the Buddha through the life of Socrates and to reflect Socrates through the life of the Buddha. The two of them are roughly contemporaneous according to scholarly dating, but if you read Don's book, you'll realize that this is a very, very fluid business trying to actually pin down dates to the Buddha. But I find that Socrates in Western culture has a similar role as the Buddha does in Asian culture, at being really at the root of a whole civilizational movement, really, not just a religion or not just a school of philosophy, but an actual way of thinking and being human that finds its origins in these two figures. So it seemed to be a good moment to actually try to bring them into some kind of conversation with each other, hopefully both illuminating the other, and also exploring how their followers over the following centuries developed and further refined their ideas.
Mm-hmm. So, Don, you hope to remythologize the Buddha. You state that pretty clearly in your book. What do you think we lose when we drop the Buddha's mythological dimension?
Well, I think we lose almost his entire biography. So we obviously lose the previous lives, all the Jataka tales, and obviously the most important and popular form of Buddhist literature. We miss the story of his birth, his descent into his mother's womb from Tusha to heaven and emerging from her right side. We miss the night of his enlightenment when he's attacked by Mara. We go through all of the major events of the Buddha's life, which are counted in different ways by different Buddhist schools, and most of those have to go away if we demythologize him. So what we're left is with some texts, not all texts, a particular selection of texts that present him in a certain way. And we have to then set aside, for example, the Mahayana Sutras. We have to set aside all of the representations of the Buddha in the other Nikaya schools, including many Theravada accounts. So there's not much left, would be my argument, once we demythologize him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Stephen, the Dalai Lama is quoted in Don's book, and I probably have this wrong, but he said something, if he's a human being, that's nice, but if he's not more than that, we lose something. And I think it's more or less what Don was referencing. But what do you think we gain by emphasizing his humanity or humanizing him and peeling away the mythological aspects that people may have difficulty with?
Well, I mean, if you read Don's book, you'll find that this is a process that's occurred throughout the history of Buddhism. the different communities that have taken on board Buddhist teachings, be they in India or be they in China or Japan or whatever, all of them, as it were, find their own Buddha to meet the particular needs of their culture in their times. And so consequently, you have all of these various iterations of how the Buddha speaks and lives for these different communities throughout history. Now, as a Westerner coming from a completely unreligious family, and one who recently, in the last 20 or so years, have been very concerned to try to, as it were, articulate a secular Buddhism, one that's not tied to the dominant forms of the Buddhist religion, I take an interest in, through these same texts, in trying to track down those pieces, those passages, those texts that in a way give us a glimpse, at least, of an actual human being, someone I can relate to as a secular person coming out of a humanist society and seeking to find a voice in which to articulate Buddhist values in the kind of world we live in now. Yeah, that's my main point.
Okay.
I think I mean, for me, something is very much gained in this process. But again, that depends on my particular take on what I'm looking for.
Right. Well, the takes are very different. There are some areas of consonance, which I'll get to. But Stephen, a question I have is, can we have the Buddha without Buddhism? I mean, you talk about Socrates. He didn't start a religion. His ideas permeate our culture. Would the same apply here if the Buddha were simply a philosopher? And so back to the question, can we have the Buddha without Buddhism? Does that make sense?
Sort of, yeah. I think probably not actually, because the Buddha, or Gautama, as I prefer to call him, looking after something human, is of course only comes to us through the Buddhist tradition, through its various iterations. I'd find it quite difficult to imagine a person who was somehow completely disconnected from everything that followed in his wake. That doesn't make an awful lot of sense for me.
So, Don, I'll ask you the inverse. Can we have Buddhism without the Buddha?
Yeah, so you're asking a variation of a famous question from Wittgenstein. Can you play chess without the queen? This would be, getting out the chessboard and putting the pieces, black and white, in their particular places, then removing the queen from each side. You can certainly play the game because we know how the pieces move, but is it chess? That is, what is missing? And so actually, Wittgenstein did not know it, but this whole argument had been made by Chandrakirti centuries before, talking about the chariot. When we take away pieces of a chariot, is it still a chariot? So I guess I would say that can you have Buddhism without the Buddha? I think you can certainly have Buddhism without the historical Buddha. That's, of course, my argument. The historical Buddha, that entire quest is in some ways a separate conversation. So I think the supernatural Buddha, the ahistorical Buddha, that Buddha is clearly there in their tradition and always has been. And so I think you can certainly then have Buddhism without the historical Buddha, but we need the other one.
Yeah, I should just mention, in case our listeners don't know, you both have deep backgrounds in the Gelug tradition. You encountered the Gelug tradition very early. So you took very different directions, and I'll get to that a little bit later, but I just thought it was important to say that. Both your renderings of the Buddha draw from the Western tradition, although in very different ways. Stephen, your Buddha is a great philosopher, and like Socrates, was primarily concerned with ethics, or to quote you, how to live a good, just, and dignified life in an unstable world. Can you say something more about this Buddha, this philosopher Buddha concerned with ethics and ethical living?
Well, maybe I could just take a step back before going on to that exact question. The way in which that I've come, as it were, to have what I feel to be a sort of personal relationship with this figure is due to having spent an awful lot of time in India, traveling to the various places that he taught. I've done that main Buddha pilgrimage about 5 or 6 times now. Spent a huge amount of time just being in these places. The other thing that really has made a major impact on me in my quest for this person is a book called A Dictionary of Pali Proper Names by the Sri Lankan scholar of the 1930s called G.P. Malalasekara. Now, for a long time, I thought, why would I need a dictionary of Pali proper names? It probably don't. It's an encyclopedia which has got every single person, every single place name, every single text name that is mentioned in the Buddhist literature. And it has an entry and it's cross-referenced to all the other entries. It's 3 thick volumes of stuff. Now, when I started diving into all of that, I found the incredible level of detail extraordinary. The number of people, the places, many of which then, of course, made sense because of my knowledge of the geography of the place. But more than anything else, it's not so much that I landed on the historical Buddha, but I landed on a very human, complex, quirky community of people living, we assume, around the 5th century BC. And that, to me, brought alive not just the person of the Buddha, who still remains vague, I fully admit that, but very much the human world in which he existed, in which he taught, in which he thrived. And I find that by putting all of that together, it's extremely difficult for me to imagine why you would make all that stuff up, why you would somehow invent all of that detail, particularly since it plays no role whatsoever in virtually all of the suttas and all of the discourses. It's basically background, scene setting detail that has been preserved in the context of presenting the teachings, which are, of course, the key thing. So in this sense, I've actually forgotten your question, James. What was the actual question?
Oh, it was your use of, I mean, the sort of parallels you draw between the Buddha and Socrates as philosophers concerned
Okay.
with ethics and how to live a good, just, and
Yeah.
dignified life.
Well, it's by understanding the Buddha more and more in the actual communal, social, and political and economic world in which he's depicted in the Pali Suttas, that I find him to be more than just a religious teacher, but also a philosopher. Endless dialogues, as with the case of Socrates. And also, I find an emphasis coming back again and again and again and again to the Eightfold Path. The Eightfold Path being, for me, the essential structure of an ethical, good life. And the Eightfold Path, remember, being the very first thing that the Buddha is supposedly said to have announced in his first discourse. And also it's the very final thing that he has taught to his last disciple, a man called Subhadda, who approached him on his deathbed and asked, after you're gone, how will we know if someone claims to be teaching Buddhism, that it is your teaching? And the answer is, if it contains the Noble Eightfold Path. So the path, to me, structured around every aspect of humanity, is a template, I feel, primarily for an ethical existence, not just an existence in which we get deep philosophical insights into the nature of reality, or we get deep contemplative, mystical states of experience through meditation and so on, but is actually about a life that allows us to flourish in the fullness of our humanity.
Thank you, Stephen. As I said, you both draw from the Western philosophical and literary traditions. Don, you use Gustave Flaubert's The Temptation of St. Anthony to provide your portrait of the Buddha with its frame, as you say. Can you say something more about this decision? I mean, I hadn't realized how interested in Buddhism Flaubert was, but that was my own ignorance. And can you say something about Flaubert and about using The Temptation of St. Anthony to frame your Buddha?
So if one is going to write a biography of the Buddha, one needs to decide what are your sources. And so I decided to choose 5 famous texts, which are biographical in one way or another, none of which are Mahayana. However, how do you sort of put those together? So as I mentioned, I've worked a lot on 19th century views of the Buddha, especially in France. And that's where he really becomes the philosopher that Stephen has described. But there was also at that time Gustave Flaubert, one of the great novelists of world literature. And he considered his own masterpiece to be The Temptation of St. Anthony. So in this work, all of the various gods of human history come and visit St. Anthony in his desert retreat. And one of those is the Buddha. In fact, the figure who has the longest speeches is the Buddha himself, and occurs right in the center of the text. So Flaubert knew Burnouf's work quite well. He'd read Burnouf's translation of the Lotus Sutra, and he'd also read the Lalita Vistara, the play in full, which had been translated from Tibetan into French by Burnouf's student Foucault. And so he was really using the Lalita Vistara as his template and drawing from that. So I just used Flaubert's version of that and then just gave a very lengthy commentary to each of those statements by the Buddha. So that was just a way to provide a frame to keep the book from being 1,000 pages long, which it could have been. Yeah.
I'm sure both your books could have been 1,000, and I'm sure your editors cut them down some. Don, you were an advisor to an exhibition of Buddhist art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which you were kind enough to walk our staff through here in New York, that displayed a good amount of aniconic art, that is, Buddhist art before the Buddha himself was represented in sculpture. So in your preface to the book, you write, "I knew the story and I knew the history. I could not see the hero. This book is an attempt to find him." So what did you find?
Well, I found the Buddha really existing in nature. And so the cover of the book has a painting by Redon. And if you look at it at your first viewing, you don't really see the Buddha there. He emerges from out of the forest. And so when we see these early aniconic representations of the Buddha, he's always among nagas and yakshas and various sorts of tree spirits and demigods. There are rarely humans there, except when they're perhaps worshiping at the Bodhi tree. These are all things that happen after the Buddha's death. And so what I wanted to do was to really sort of go back to that earliest Buddhist art and see the Buddha as someone who was really someone who sat under trees. I was astounded to see how important trees are in the life of the Buddha. It occurs from the time his first meditation when he's a little boy, during the famous plowing festival, going all the way through. He spends 7 weeks under different trees after his enlightenment. And during those 7 weeks, which are the most, in some ways, the most fascinating part of his life, he does not speak to a single human until these two merchants show up in the 7th week. So I really was trying to portray the Buddha as a figure coming out of Indian nature more than Indian history. And so that's what I found by that fabulous exhibition at the Met.
Stephen, I wonder what your thoughts on that are. I mean, you search for the Buddha in a different way. Your methodology differs, but I have a feeling that this idea of the Buddha emerging out of nature strikes you in some way.
Well, that goes back, it does indeed strike me very much. And I've also, like Don, been very struck by the use of trees, the trees under which he dies, the trees under which he's born, the trees under which he's very embedded in the natural world. And this was, again, one of the reasons why I enjoyed spending so much time actually in the sites where the Buddha and his followers would have lived, although, of course, there's absolutely no trace of them anymore, nor is there any trace actually of the things that they would have, the places they would have lived and so on. All of this is gone. But nonetheless, there's something in that experience of being in these places whereby even though there's no Buddhist stuff around at all, you are hearing the same birds that they would have heard. You would have smelt the same flowers and crops that they would have known. You would have seen the same basic structure of the farmland, which hasn't changed much in 2,500 years. So there's a sense in pilgrimage in general, which I'm a great advocate of pilgrimage, that actually brings you into earthly proximity with these figures that you know of in your mind and you've heard about in books. But I found it kind of earthed, as in electricity, it earthed my experience of the Buddha to somehow locate him in this environment, in this air, amongst these smells and sounds and taste, all of which are entirely natural. So I very much agree with that. I think that is very much where the Buddha is emerging from, is from that physical world of the Indian subcontinent.
You know, as different as your approaches are, sometimes I hear things that I think are convergent. I'm not sure. But, we recently hosted each of your book launches. And at Don's book launch, somebody asked him about his use of the word wonder. And Don, you then talked about it in terms of imagination. First, I'd like to ask you, what role does imagination play in not only our rendering or reconstruction of the Buddha, but in our understanding of Buddhism or the Buddha or even Buddhist practice?
Well, imagination is everywhere, of course, right? I mean, we think first of visualization in meditation practice, regardless of the tradition that you're looking at, being able to visualize the object is so important from the earliest Pali representations through tantric meditation. So just in terms of practice, imagination is absolutely central. But then there's also the fact that when we talk about the Buddha and the way he's understood, for example, in the Mahayana, the body that we see in our world is called the Nirmanakaya, which is the emanation body. Nirmana has a sense of magical creation, and so that be able to understand the Buddha as that figure, and the Buddha who very famously, even in the Nikaya Sutras, it said that when the Buddha teaches an audience of 5,000, each person in the audience sees themselves sitting alone at the Buddha's feet, with the Buddha teaching them something particularly for them in their own, not only their native language, but their native dialect. And so the Buddha has these magical powers, of course, that are so central to his identity. When we look at, for example, the Dalai Lama's first book, which I translated, his chapter on the Buddha has no biography whatsoever. It's just a list of these qualities, these dharmas, this dharmakaya. And so without the imagination, I think it's impossible to practice Buddhism. It's impossible to understand who the Buddha is. And I think if we strip him of those qualities, we're left with, we lose out on such a huge body of fantastic Buddhist literature, these classic works, masterpieces of human literature, which are biographies of the Buddha that tell all of these stories, and they're filled with magic and wonder.
Stephen, can you say something about, thank you, Don. That was great. Stephen, you write a lot about imagination and especially in the context of the Eightfold Path also. So can you say something about imagination too?
Yeah, well, I too, I agree with Don. I think the imagination it does play an absolutely central role in Buddhist practice, though I would probably put the emphasis more on ethics again. And I've started translating the word sankappa or samkalpa, which is often translated just as thought, sometimes as intention, but I think it actually gets very close to something like imagination. And imagination is for me something that is involved not just in visualizing Buddhas or imagining the different mythological stories that we hear about, but imagination is also very much to do with how we actually confront an ethical dilemma. Imagination is what allows us to be empathetic. In other words, I can imagine how that other person must feel. Imagination also has to do with our capacity to imagine the different responses that might be more or less appropriate in responding to that ethical dilemma. I have to be able to play out, as it were, in a kind of theatrical way, what the consequences of my actions might be. And that's all done through the imagination. So imagination is something that it frames the whole Buddhist project in many ways, from meditation, as Don explained, but also I think very much in actually living your life as fully as you can, imagining the kind of person that you would aspire to be in the best of all possible worlds. That's very much the project of any kind of ethical life is to imagine. And I don't find any problem really between, on the one hand, conceiving of the Buddha as an eminently human person, and at the same time, as a human person who has generated this incredible body of literature, of myth, of all kinds of stories and iconography and so forth and so on. To me, that only serves, as it were, to flesh out more fully, in a more imaginative type way of thinking, the personhood of the Buddha that I'm also still very much trying to sort of get grips on. But I don't think the two approaches are actually incompatible whatsoever. They support each other.
You know, before I finish my own questions, I'm going to pull out a question from the Q&A tab. David asks, I'm interested in hearing about the speaker's thoughts about the magical in Buddhism, which is not materialistically understood, but miraculous, or that which is a shift in our perception of the world. I mean, I think here, say, of the Lotus Sutra as an example. Don, do you want to start? And then we'll go to you, Stephen, this understanding of the magical in Buddhism, or your thoughts about the magical in Buddhism.
I think, well, magical wonder, the miraculous, so all of these things we've talked about. I mean, we can just go through the giant stupa emerging from the earth in the Lotus Sutra, and the Buddha floating up to the sky to open up that door, and finding Prabhuta, this Buddha who's been inside that stupa for millennia. And they sit down next to each other, the two Buddhas seated side by side, famously. So one could talk endlessly about the miraculous and how important it is in Buddhism. Yeah.
Stephen?
Well, I would take the miraculous in the opposite direction. To me, what Buddhist practice has done, and I'm thinking here of my practices of mindfulness, and also very much in my practices of doing Zen in Korea, that those sort of practices which cultivate paying closer and closer immediate attention to what is actually impacting your senses at any given moment, or Zen practice like asking questions like, what is this? So trying to suspend yourself in a state of inquiry and wonder and perplexity and curiosity, and doing that for hours on end every day. What that brings to me, what that led me to, what that leads me to, is discovering the miraculous in the actual everyday, in discovering the sheer wonder of taking a breath, the sheer wonder of hearing the sound of a bird. Whereas I find in a lot of Buddhist iconography and other literature, the magical and the mysterious and so on is thought of largely in terms of miraculous events or supernatural type events. I prefer to actually to uncover the miraculous in the heart of the ordinary, in the heart of our everyday experience from moment to moment.
Now, a question I know that you've both, thank you, Stephen. I think a question that you've both given a lot of consideration to, I know you have, is historical consciousness. Can each of you say something about the importance of historical consciousness in being a Buddhist, or at least a Western Buddhist? I mean, our historical consciousness is not something that seems to have existed centuries ago. I know this is something you've discussed before, so I'd like to, I think our listeners would love to hear about it. Don, do you want to start?
Sure. So I teach Introduction to Buddhism at Michigan every fall. And in the first lecture, I tell the students that they have to use two parts of their brain to succeed in the class. The first is their imagination. They have to be able to imagine what it would mean to believe in rebirth, for example. But they also have to maintain the part of their brain which is their scholar brain, their ability to analyze and to think about historical conditions and how they produce our world. So the dilemma, I think, for the practicing Buddhist is how do we maintain our historical consciousness, and what contradictions does that present to us, and how do we resolve those? So I'll give one example. So when you take the Bodhisattva vows, as I think probably Stephen and I both have, you're supposed to recite them every day, recite the transgressions to remember what they are. And so it starts out by saying, Dr. Shenmur Chunamida Shing. So to praise oneself and to belittle others, you're not supposed to do that. You are supposed to be willing to give away the Dharma and your own wealth. Not to do that is a transgression. Shakyang Minyan Techenbong Watang. So Shakyang Minyan means not to accept an apology. Bodhisattvas must accept all apologies. But the next one is they must not abandon the Mahayana. What that means is they must not say that the Mahayana Sutras are not the word of the Buddha. This is a tough one, obviously, right? Because we have a great deal of historical evidence to show that the Mahayana Sutras were composed long after the passing of the Buddha. And we know that all great philosophers from Nagarjuna in the 3rd century to Aryavimukta Sena further on I think in the 11th century. A standard part of their work was a defense of the Mahayana as the word of the Buddha. We know that this was the great critique made by probably the majority of monks in India. So how do we deal with this? How do we maintain not abandon the Mahayana Sutras, see them as the word of the Buddha, and yet know historically that they aren't? That's a question that I struggle with daily.
Thanks, Don. Stephen?
Well, for me, historical consciousness is the difference that makes the difference in the context of Buddhism coming into, I'm not going to say the West, but I would say global modernity that we now currently experience. And a very simple example of this would be that if you ask a Westerner, if you point out, saying, well, Buddhists in Sri Lanka do this kind of thing and believe these kind of things. Buddhists in Japan, the Pure Land Buddhists, they do these kind of things and believe different kind of things. Why is that so? And a lot of traditional Buddhists, or maybe some of my traditional Buddhist friends, would say, well, because the Sri Lankans, they actually have the true Dharma, and the Japanese have something gone wrong. And a bit like the Mahayana is sort of a perversion of what is going on. But a Western person today, or I would say a globally Western educated type person today, if asked that same question, will say, well, it's kind of obvious, isn't it, really? In Sri Lanka, you've got a whole different set of conditions and circumstances that people with different questions and in interests and priorities. And Buddhism is a response to those questions, and that generates a form of Buddhism that's highly distinctive and compatible with Sri Lankan culture, whereas in Japan, very different historical circumstances, very different cultural circumstances, and that has generated yet another iteration of Buddhism that is, on the surface, looks completely different to what you find in Sri Lanka. If you take historical consciousness as the way of reading those facts, as it were, those historical facts, you're allowed a huge amount more possibility for how the Dharma actually plays itself out. There doesn't have to be one correct version and one version that is wrong. They're different responses to different situations in the world in the course of history. And also, I think one of the things that really works extraordinarily well with historical consciousness is the very idea of dependent origination, paticca samuppada. I think by studying history, you actually get a very good account of how paticca samuppada, dependent origination, operates in cultural, social settings and takes it out of it just being an analysis of certain kinds of human, cravings and what that gives rise to and so on. It enriches one's sense of conditionality to be able to see that in terms of history. And I think also it allows us to recognize how Buddhism is also impermanent, contingent, never totally satisfactory, always undergoing change, always responding to new situations, and always generating new images and stories about itself.
Don, in your last book, the one that's been nominated for a Pulitzer, congratulations, you do talk about the contingent nature of Buddhism or its continual evolution. Is that correct? I mean, you do
Of
make
course, yeah. Yep.
yeah. Okay. I guess it's sort of we're getting questions about literal belief, and I think you both addressed that. But somebody asks, does the literal existence of the Buddha matter, like Jesus and Christianity? I mean, some people like to say it's true, but it never happened. I mean, I've heard that too. That's helpful to me. But is the literal existence of the Buddha, and I'm not asking you to say whether or not he existed, is that as important in Buddhism as, say, believing in Jesus and Christianity? Although there are plenty of people who understand historical contingency who remain Christian, but what do you say to that? Is that as central or as important in Buddhism?
I'm not so sure. I probably not in some level. I mean, the reality is I don't know whether the Buddha existed as a person historically or not. I mean, I have to be entirely honest there. I don't know. I really don't know. But I would say on the balance of all the circumstantial evidence that I've come across, I would say it's extremely likely that there was such a person. And I find it valuable as a secular Buddhist to think in those terms of an historical person that I can relate to and so forth and so on. But I could imagine other modalities of Buddhism, and I think the vast majority, in fact, of Buddhist schools that have existed up until now have really had little, if any, interest at all as to whether the Gautama was an historical figure or not. In fact, nearly all Buddhists until recently assumed that the Buddha who lived on earth and taught in Varanasi and Bodh Gaya and so on actually looked like the figure with the 32 marks and the Ushnisha on his head and so on, and someone who doesn't look human at all. And that's been the model that's been just uncritically accepted throughout history. You get certain pushbacks against that in Zen. You get certain pushbacks against that, I think, in Vajrayana too, in some degree, maybe in other schools as well. But I don't think it's essential. But for my own particular approach, I find it kind of necessary.
Don?
Yeah, so I have to agree that I don't know whether the Buddha was a historical figure or not, but I think my argument in the book is that the Buddha was not a historical figure, and that's okay. That is, in many ways, it's more inspiring to me to think of the Buddha with all of his teachings and all of his miracles as the creation of the human imagination, rather than a single figure who did or didn't do all of these things, who was just encrusted with myth. I like to think of this as something that ordinary humans imagined and were able to inspire us for 2.5 millennia so far.
You know, I don't know what people were expecting when they came here. Maybe this would be a clash of the Titans or whatever. But, I know the two of you had lunch together not too long ago, and you're very friendly and respectful of each other. So I won't pry about the lunch, but I wonder if it's fair to ask what you each find compelling or at least interesting about each other's work. Don, do you want to start?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think Stephen, I think one thing that impresses me so much about his new book is the depth of his knowledge, not only of the Pali Canon, but also of Greek philosophy, Greek drama. His book is also, to call it the Buddha, Socrates, and Us. In some ways, and I wonder whether you thought about this, it should be the Buddha, Socrates, and Me, because it's also very much your own kind of intellectual autobiography, which I found fascinating and quite eloquent. So it's a great book, and I highly recommend it to everybody. At the same time, when we have to look at Stephen, I think also as a historical figure. So this is a person who has tried to create a new type of Buddhism. That is to base himself with a deep knowledge of the Pali tradition, but he also was, as you mentioned, a Gelug monk, and then also a monk in Korea. And Buddhism, of course, has changed many, many times over history. We look at all of these different schools where we have, for example, someone saying, if you say Namo Amida Butsu, you're reborn in the Pure Land. Just say it once, you're in. We have so many different schools of Buddhism that have occurred over the course of history in Asia. And now there is something called Western Buddhism, which is, I think, a school, which has the characteristics of a school. And Stephen, I think, is the most articulate sort of representative and spokesperson and actually articulator of that school.
Well, I'm very flattered, Don. Thank you for that economium. Is that the word? That's very kind of you to say that. I'm not sure I see myself that way at all. I see myself as a bit of a guinea pig, someone who's dedicated their whole life to trying to figure out what Buddhism is about and what it might mean for us. And I did think, actually, for a time of Buddha, Socrates, and me, but it sounds so incredibly egocentric that it never. No, but the us is actually meant to say us in the sense of what do their teachings mean for us, people in the world today? Do they actually still mean anything much to us? But in terms of I've followed a career which has not involved getting any academic degrees whatsoever. Many of my friends who were monks together. They subsequently went off and got doctorates and became famous professors in prestigious universities around the world. I didn't take that step. I don't think of myself as a Buddhist scholar in that sort of rigorous way that the academy would expect it to be. And I have to confess that I do that because there's a part of me that's reluctant to actually engage with Buddhist materials from that in a quest for some sort of scientific objectivity, as you know, and analyzing the philology and all of these different aspects and the history and so on. I don't want to take that distance. I don't want to have that distance between me. These texts for me are texts that I'm trying to hear what they might be saying to my condition now. That's very important for me. I want subjectivity involved. I'm not interested in pursuing that more objective approach. But having said that, I'm a great reader of works of people like Don Lopez, Don Lopez, and other scholars whose work I think is incredibly helpful and important and necessary if we are to really move towards a new articulation of what Buddhism might be. I don't think we could possibly consider that without this kind of these now nearly 200 years of studies, of analyses of texts, of getting greater and greater clarity, also archaeological evidence and so on. This is incredibly rich. And I'm very grateful to writers like Don. Don's work I particularly like because Don writes so well, and he's willing to step outside the box of his maybe what the department would like him to do, and brings a freshness and a kind of a broader perspective on these texts and iconography and other things he's studying. So I gain a great deal from that. I'm enormously grateful for it, but it's not something I'm drawn to do myself. I think of myself more as a theologian, if I'm entirely honest. I'm not a philosopher, really. I'm a theologian, except I don't believe in God. But yeah, but the kind of writing I do has been influenced very much by, by liberal Protestant theologians, primarily in Christianity.
You know, what occurs to me as each of you answer that is that we're living at a time when all different forms of Buddhism are sort of bumping up against each other, and there's a lot of cross-fertilization. I get the sense that both of you feel that in order for Buddhism, I could be wrong, but in order for Buddhism to flourish here, if it does, something new has to emerge. Don, you wrote a piece for us about all of the different canons coming together. And Stephen, you're hammering out a vision that is not palatable to Western philosophical understanding of the world, but one that makes sense for many people in modernity. It's not just the West. Maybe it's an unfair question, but how do you see this evolving? What is the future? Although you can't predict. I mean, something is happening. I mean, I understand that at Nalanda, there were different philosophical traditions living side by side, and there was a kind of pluralism there. But certainly over the centuries, the traditions became separate from one another. Now we have them all coming together again. What does that mean? Or what does that bode?
I'm not at the Buddha, so I can't see the future. So I don't have a good answer for that.
Very good. Stephen, what do you think?
Well, I have to agree.
Either, right?
I mean, I have no idea where any of this is going. I really don't.
Well, there's so much complexity. I mean, it's
yeah,
really
and I
impossible
think
to tell.
the only thing I think we can do is somehow just do our best in whatever particular field we're working, and really give it our all. And I can't really see that we could do much more than that. I mean, what I think both Don and I are doing together is we are addressing a wider public that may not necessarily be Buddhist. We're trying to communicate through ideas. We're trying to articulate what Buddhism means. And we're doing so, I think, in a very heartfelt way. I think it's something we're very much committed to in our own particular ways. And I don't really see how you could do more than that, frankly. And I think to have some preconceived idea of where we're going, I don't think is particularly helpful. I think it's more a question of just putting your money, your mouth where your money is, or your money where
Your
your
money where
mouth
your
is.
mouth is. Yeah.
Money where your mouth is. And
Put it
just
bluntly.
going for it.
Yeah.
And taking as examples, many of the great figures from the past, people like Tsongkhapa, for example, or Dogen. These are very inspiring for me. Shantideva, particularly, is absolutely central to my Buddhist practice, even though I'm not technically a Mahayana Buddhist. But yeah, I think we're living in amazing times, and I think the fact that all of these traditions are sort of coming together in our, coming together for the first time, really, and interacting with each other. I think it's an amazing period to be alive in. And I'm very, very, grateful to have been given the opportunities I have to be able to be part of that.
Yeah, as I told you before, Stephen, it's like you wrote this book without looking over your shoulder. You're just going for it. I found that very powerful. So I'm just going to go to a few questions. It's a little bit of a break from the conversation, but Brian Victoria asks, has animism influenced Buddhism? Either one of you can take that.
Animism.
Animism, has animism influenced Buddhism? I think of the aniconic art and all of the natural world that is centered, but
Yeah, of course. I mean, so many of the sutras are talking about yakshas and how to deal with yakshas and nagas. I mean, they're everywhere in Indian Buddhism, and then they get translated into their own forms as Buddhism spreads around the world. So what happens is that as Buddhism spreads, the local deities are all incorporated into the Buddhist pantheon, often as in the demigod category, for example. And they then become worshipped through Buddhist means. And so the animistic traditions of all areas of Asia to date have been incorporated into the Buddhist pantheon. So it's a huge part of the tradition, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, I would go. I would agree. I think that seems fairly self-evident, really. Um, Another question related to that would be, is that animistic dimension of Buddhism still one that will work for us today? What is it that it provides that might actually speak to us now? And I think Don has already mentioned the fact that how this immediately is a way of talking about the natural world. And I think in our times, we are very concerned about the natural world. Whether or not we literally believe in yakshas and devas and these various non-human spirits is a way beside the point. But what I think it's pointing to is that human beings inhabit a world of other beings, not just animals, but perhaps beings we can't really understand at all. And we need to recognize that the Dharma is not just a human thing that makes human feeling beings enlightened, but it always is operating within an embeddedness within a natural environment that is integral, I think, to fleshing out our understanding of what impermanence and dukkha and other principal Buddhist values are about.
Okay, before I ask the next question, I just want our listeners to know it's obviously we can't get to all of your questions. I'm reading the ones in the Q&A tab, but you can always write to feedback@tricycle.org, ask your questions. Maybe we can collate them and ask Stephen and Don to answer them afterwards if we have time. But just to let you know, we would love to get to you all, but it's not possible. So here's a question. So many people know Buddhism from Alan Watts and the Beats. What do our speakers think of this 50s to 70s view that many of us have encountered? That's from Fortune Buckholz.
Don, you go on this one first.
So James, as you know, in the piece I wrote for Tricycle about the translation of the Buddhist canon, the argument I was making was, so this was an essay that was inspired by a conference at Berkeley called AI and the Future of Buddhist Studies. That is, once we have AI able to translate the entire Buddhist canon or all Buddhist canons, what do we do next? And what I pointed out, and this will happen very soon, and what I pointed out is that when we look at the history of Buddhism, what happens when the canon has been translated is that people stop reading it. And so if that's the case in our own culture, then what we have to do next is start writing sutras ourselves in English or in our native European tongue or whatever your language might be, modern sutras for the modern day. And you kindly included Ginsberg's Sunflower Sutra, which I read at the end of my talk in Berkeley in the magazine. So that to me is a classic of American Buddhism and a sutra that's just as inspiring as anything that we find in Sanskrit. Alan Watts is a different story. I think they're two very different figures. I'm much more of a Ginsberg fan myself, which for reasons we can talk about forever. Yeah.
Stephen?
I think all of these people were actually very seminal in the after-war period for somehow preparing us not just for the cultural rush of the 60s, but also for setting the scene very much for an interest in Eastern philosophy and religion to be an integral part of the 60s subculture. They're all important figures. I'm also more of a Ginsberg fan. I also like Gary Snyder's Smokey the Bear Sutra. You didn't mention that one, Don. That's another ace. And I like that idea very much of writing as it were our own sutras. Not something I would, very readily set about doing, though it has crossed my mind a few times. But no, I think I'll leave that one behind. But yeah, I think the Beats. And Watts is a complicated character. At some level, I think I did read Alan Watts when I was a teenager, and he has a very, very good way of summing up pithy bits of Eastern wisdom in a very sort of digestible manner. But I went back not long ago and looked up some old Alan Watts books, and it's terribly dated, and it really doesn't speak to me much anymore at all. But apparently people listen very much to his audio tapes, a lot of young people too. He's still very popular. He's got a way with language and a way of getting some of these ideas across in a fashion that a lot of other Buddhist teachers don't seem to be able to do so well.
It's funny, a friend of mine, a friend of both of yours too, said that she remembers reading beat literature and she was really taken by it. And all these years later, she goes, I can't believe how misogynistic it is. She's incredibly misogynistic, but she still valued that introduction to Buddhism. Again, everybody, we're not going to get to all your questions. There are just so many and they're in different places, and I'm doing my best here. But here's a question that people always ask, and I never have an answer because I don't know that there is one. But Scott Godlewski asks, what is a Buddhist? Is there a minimum requirement? Like, it reminds me of the conversation that Stephen, you and Bob Thurman had many years ago. Can you be a Buddhist and not believe in rebirth? Something like that. But what is a Buddhist, and is there a minimum requirement? That gets asked often.
I've got a very simple answer to that. Anybody who sincerely considers themselves to be a Buddhist, that's good enough for me.
Well, you say 3 times, I go for refuge to the Buddha, I go for refuge to the Dharma, I go for refuge to the Sangha, and you're in.
Yeah, that's often the refuge is the refuge chant is often the definition. I've heard that too. So also, thank you both. It's been really great talking to you. I admire your work very, very much. And again, I think we need to put the book links in the chat. Again, if you did not get a chance to answer a question, get your question answered, write us at Tricycle at feedback@tricycle.org, and we'll try to look through them. But thank you, Stephen and Don, and thank you everyone for joining us. We'll send a replay of this event in a follow-up email later today. I'm glad there's been so much interest. Again, Tricycle is a nonprofit. If you'd like to donate to Tricycle, visit tricycle.org/donate. The best way to support us is to subscribe, which you can do by visiting tricycle.org/subscribe. Again, both these books are really wonderful, and I suggest you check out the link. Thanks again, and we hope to see you soon. And thank you both, Stephen and Don. It's always a great pleasure.
Thank you, James.
Thank you very much, James. Thank you, Don.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone,
you
for
all the people
watching.
at Tricycle.
Yep.
And thank
Thank
all of
you.
you for being here
Yep.
very much.
It was a
Thank you.
good turnout. That was great.
Good turnout. Yeah.